In his report to the 19th CPC National Congress, General Secretary Xi Jinping said that China has stood up, grown rich, and become strong. Looking ahead to mid-century 2050, Xi said China will move towards center stage and make greater contributions to mankind. He reiterated that no matter what stage of development China reaches, it will never seek hegemony or engage in expansion. But it's no secret that some countries remain suspicious. Why? Why is Xi setting forth a grand vision of global governance, with China playing an enhanced role? What are the basic principles, the key components, the practical consequences? Why is China now changing its foreign policy from reactive to proactive? Why break with the past? Related, how does China's new foreign policy relate to China's domestic development as well as to world conditions? But it must also be asked, is China prepared to engage the world, assume the responsibilities, and bear the burdens? What are the implications for China and for the world? Answering these questions brings us closer to China. When Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the party in late 2012 and then President of the country in early 2013, in a dynamic and volatile international environment, he accelerated China's proactive diplomacy, calling for mutual benefits and win-win cooperation, especially with the developing world. 5 years later, as socialism with Chinese characteristics enters into a new era, according to the 19th CPC National Congress, Xi Jinping, on multiple occasions, explained the core concepts and overarching goal of a new kind of global governance and the building of a community of shared future for all mankind. Venues include the G20, UN annual meetings, BRICS Summit, and APEC. The perception is, since President Xi became president and leader of the country, that China has become more proactive in its foreign affairs. Some would say more assertive, others would say more aggressive, and point to a whole host of issues, the South China Sea being the most obvious, but there are a whole series of actions that China has taken. Is that a fair assessment that under President Xi, China has become more assertive? What's the proper word?
I think China has become more proactive on territorial issues, in protecting what Chinese believe is their legitimate interests and rights in the South China Sea, and probably also in the East China Sea. Okay. Why this is an issue? I think there is a lot of misunderstanding there. What China has been doing is what China has always claimed to do in the past. That is to protect China's legitimate interests and rights, rather than to do something very different. Okay. In other words, Chinese claims, territorial claims, today have not exceeded its previous claims in the South China Sea and in East China Sea. China have always claimed these things: islands, rocks, and adjacent waters. Okay. So it has nothing to do with territorial expansion. If you look at Chinese government's record on territorial disputes, Chinese government over the past decades have been trying to negotiate border agreements with its neighbors to fix its borders rather than to leave them open for future expansion. Okay.
How would you characterize China's foreign policy under President Xi Jinping, and how does it reflect his vision of China's diplomacy?
Xi Jinping was making a connection between the realization of great Chinese national rejuvenation with the Chinese foreign policy. He said that China now one of the major countries in the world. Therefore, we should have a foreign policy. This changed the situation, and we are to make more contribution to the world in the world governance and so on. And if we are trying to have certain words describing his foreign policy, then four words will come to mind. It is peace, development, cooperation, and win-win. So you can see that from these emphases, people can find tremendous changes.
If we look at President Xi's primary vision of foreign policy, an international community of shared future or common destiny, win-win cooperation, mutual development, what are some specific examples of the expression of that policy that have occurred under President Xi, so we can see the specific policies that emerge from those theories?
Normally people would say that in economic cooperation you can find this linkage. For instance, in talking about globalization, and Xi Jinping was said that we are living in this world. There are anti-globalization voices heard nowadays. However, he said that China felt that several decades ago he was standing on the beaches of this great ocean of globalization. We did not know how to swim then, but then we were pushed and we plunged into this and we learned how to swim while swimming. And he said now there's no way for anybody to go back because this is the right way. If the world, because the world economy as a whole, you have the international market, you have raw materials, you have production, and you need to have markets. International community, if we join hands, we make the economic pie much larger. This is just the right way, and also a situation in which we find that we are all part of the community with a shared nature.
What are the primary principles of President Xi Jinping's foreign policy, and how do they reflect his vision of what China is, and maybe more importantly, what China should become?
Well, I think the primary principles of Xi Jinping's foreign policy include, first, China's national interests and independence. Second, to develop cooperative and mutually beneficial relationship with the outside world. And also, third, to play a larger and constructive role in international affairs, to live up to China's growing international responsibilities as a big power.
This is a vision that China has been working for, and emphasize on the cooperations among countries, building partnerships rather than alliances.
Xi Jinping was making a connection between the realization of great Chinese national rejuvenation with the Chinese foreign policy.
I think China's, like any other country, is not happy with the state of affairs of global governance in the world for all kinds of reasons.
The Belt and Road Initiative is President Xi Jinping's project of the century, his grand vision of China facilitating inclusive development globally. It involves more than 60 countries and focuses on building infrastructure and interconnectivity, especially in developing countries, which also benefits China and the world. More than 40 countries and international organizations have signed agreements with China. Chinese companies have made over $50 billion of investment and launched major projects in Belt and Road countries. If I had to pick one word to characterize President Xi, I would pick the word governance. President Xi has been recently talking about global governance and has been really one of the world leaders most prominently associated with this concept of global governance. So when you do that, it means that you're not satisfied with the current global governance, or you wouldn't be talking about it. And we have the UN and various other bodies. So what is President Xi's vision for global governance, and how does it reflect his underlying way of thinking?
I think China's like any other country, is not happy with the state of affairs of global governance in the world for all kinds of reasons. As far as China is concerned, I think, as I mentioned before, China wants to be consulted more on important issues. Okay? Probably other countries want to be consulted more, especially developing countries. Decisions used to be made for them by others. And also, probably we should give less weight to domestic politics of the U.S. Okay? You know, it's an international thing. You know, we're working together to deal with international problems, but everybody is looking at the domestic politics of the U.S. You know, because in the past the U.S. was so powerful that, you know, if the U.S. government is trapped by the domestic politics issues, then you know, the whole process of cooperation would put into a standstill. Okay. Now, Chinese certainly hope that in the U.S. politics, of course, everybody has domestic politics, but the U.S. politics should not play such a prominent role in determining international affairs. Okay. Other countries have their own domestic politics. We should consult with each other more, but then we should do the things rather than wait for the U.S. domestic politics to unfold.
President Xi's most grand view of his foreign policy is centered on his idea of a common community for the future destiny, product of good global governance. Where does this concept come from? How does it reflect President Xi's way of thinking? And you know, how important is that big concept as a driver of China's foreign policy?
This is a very progressive global vision, and I think this is a vision that China has been working for, and emphasize on the cooperations among countries, building partnerships rather than alliances, right? And to seek joint development and to have you know, a better protection of the environment, and to enhance the dialogues and among the different civilizations to preserve the so-called cultural diversities in the world. So putting together to build towards kind of a community of shared future for the mankind. But this is a reflection of the long-held kind of the Chinese foreign policy orientation, but it's also becoming more necessary when many of the countries now turning inwards, overwhelmed by their domestic challenges, not willing to address all these global issues or try to protect themselves from competitions or economic exchange from other countries. So I think under these kind of circumstances, it's becoming more and more necessary for the international society, and this kind of idea can offer more hope for the world and increase the stability and certainty in the world of lots more uncertainty and instability.
China has become the world's second largest economy, trailing only the U.S., and the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, PPP. To gain greater participation in the international financial system and to support its Belt and Road Initiative, China established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, with 56 other countries. The U.S. has been reluctant to join. China has also been promoting BRICS and its new development bank. Although China states it has no intention of undermining the existing world order or of becoming the new hegemon, many countries, including the U.S., remain skeptical. Under President Xi, the concept of a new kind of big power relationship has been talked about, generally specifically related to China-U.S. relations, but also to other countries as well, the big so-called big powers of the world. What does that mean? What does a new kind of big power relationship mean, and then how does it apply to the various big powers in the world?
For the new type of relations between among the countries, I think that that is one important contribution made by Xi Jinping. He said that the first one, that we should avoid confrontation. No confrontation. The second is that we are different societies, we have different social systems, and we have different histories, maybe different cultures. Yet, what about we have a mutual respect of each other? And then for economic and for social contact, for people-to-people association, what about we have a more cooperation in all aspects? We try to have a win-win result.
I think President Xi is very aware of the importance of this relationship, not only for the two countries, but also to the rest of the world. Right? So he put forward this concept, a new model of major state relationship, try to, work with the United States to avoid the so-called the Thucydides trap, right? The conflicts between a rising power and existing dominant power. So what we see that from the United States is that it's not very much embracing the concept, but I think in essence the relationship is going in that direction. Which means that they try to avoid direct large-scale confrontations. They don't want to turn each other into enemies, and they want to pursue pragmatic cooperations, right? So even if the Trump government adopts a more combative and protectionist foreign policy, I think the two countries still managed pragmatic cooperation in some of the important issues.
How about North Korea? Obviously, there's a very long history between China and North Korea, the DPRK. But the perception is that under President Xi, there has been some kind of change in China's policy towards the DPRK, North Korea.
China's policy toward North Korea has been changing very slowly. From the previous more positive type of relationship to more and more negative because of North Korea's efforts to develop nuclear weapons. China believes that this is posing a threat to the region, and also it damages the interests of China and as well as North Korea. Okay, so China has been trying to persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons program, but North Korea has ignored China. And so every time the North Korea exploded a bomb or conducted missile tests, this hurt the relationship between the two countries. And during President Xi's time, the North Korea's activities in this regard have increased. That to some extent also explains why the shift of Chinese foreign policy quickened during Xi's time.
Commencing in 2014, China has been holding the rotational presidency or taking leadership in several international summits. including APEC, G20, and Belt and Road Forum. In 2016, China made a multi-year contribution of $200 million to the newly established United Nations Peace and Development Trust Fund. China states that it is committed and proactive in signing the Paris Agreement on climate change and in seeking peace and denuclearization on Korean issues. In 2017, President Xi's keynote addresses at the BRIC Summit in Xiamen and the APEC Summit in Vietnam exemplified China's determination to play a larger role in international affairs and global governance. President Xi seems to be putting greater emphasis on China's interaction with international bodies. You mentioned the United Nations. Certainly that's the case. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. China pays a great deal of attention to these international bodies. Is that a trend that you see continuing? And if so, what's the deep motivation under President Xi why China is putting its credibility and its interest in supporting and building these international organizations?
Well, China has a lot of stake and interest, or increasing stake and interest in the existing international institutions. Chinese tend to feel that these institutions are more influenced and controlled by the West. We all share the same, all these countries in these organizations share the view that there is too much Western pressure on them. So in a way, they unite and create these institutions to take off some of the pressures so that they can better resist the pressures.
Given President Xi's grand vision of an international community of a shared future, mutual development, win-win cooperation, it seems paradoxical that in many places in the world, the sense of a China threat during this period of time has actually been enhanced. How do you account for that?
For China, the rise of China naturally would cause certain anxiety, for instance, from among existing status quo powers. And some people say, well, China was to be like a sleeping giant. Now you are coming to the world stage. What you're up to, and we just simply do not have any clues. And China would say to them that, well, we are coming to dinner, but we bring our own brown bags, and we have our own contribution. And for instance, China's growth of China's economy, and would certainly, because of the size of the population, the size of the economy, it will certainly bring about changes in the world. So when you talk about the ships traveling through Malaccas, the oil tankers, and you talk about container ships sailing from Shanghai, from other ports to other parts of the world, you can see that China is a major player. So it's going to change some of the older scenes. So China threat, you hear people from different corners, they say that, but I would say that I hope these people to take objective and holistic view, taking into consideration all factors, and then make a good judgment.
A Chinese adage reads, "Victory is ensured when people pool their strength. Success is secured when people put their heads together." As long as we keep to the goal of building a community of shared future for mankind and work hand in hand to fulfill our responsibilities and overcome difficulties, we will be able to create a better world and deliver better lives for our peoples.
Let's look at what could be the challenges to this vision. What are the potential obstacles or pitfalls? Humanity doesn't always work the way it should. So in looking ahead to what President Xi wants to achieve, What do you worry about? What do you look out for in your simulations, in your concerns, so you can scenario plan for bad situations so that you could properly react to them?
Of course, there are so many difficulties, but if you want to pinpoint and select the most salient ones, I think President Xi Jinping has his answers, has his visions there. He says of all major difficulties, and there are two we need to guard against the most. One is in the security area, the other is in the economic area. President Xi Jinping says that we need to guard against falling into this middle income trap. China's economy was developing at a fairly high speed. But now we are faced with a transition period. China's economy used to invite more technologies, invite more investment from outside. But when you reach this point, you need to find more outlet of your financial assets. And you need to guard against international financial crisis. In the security area, I think how to keep the momentum, how to keep world peace, we have sustained the peace and security. That would be most important.
In his APEC address in Vietnam, President Xi offered a 4-point plan for the Asia-Pacific region. First, promote innovation. Second, open up economies, create a free trade area. Third, pursue inclusive development. Fourth, enrich partnerships among APEC countries. But some APEC countries are wary of China. They seek their own course, such as a new Trans-Pacific partnership that excludes China as well as the U.S. Xi's grand vision of China's foreign policy features 8 big concepts: community of shared future, win-win cooperation, economic globalization, new kind of global governance, new kind of big power relationship, expanding cooperation while managing differences, multilateralism and democratization of international relations, and people-to-people exchanges. The Belt and Road Initiative, constructing infrastructure in developing countries, exemplifies several. China's objective is to protect its 3 sacrosanct core interests: its political system, continuing economic development, and national sovereignty, territorial integrity. But President Xi also recognizes China's global responsibilities. He stresses stability, fighting terrorism, settling regional conflicts, and a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security strategy. All good. The big question, however, remains open: China's role in the world at mid-century. If I said the world is entirely confident or comfortable with China's trajectory, I'd be telling a falsehood. The world is watching. We are watching. We are closer to China.